A man who spent 9 years convincing himself he needed no one. Met a woman who arrived with a suitcase, a 5-year-old, and 60 days to prove him wrong. If you've ever been too proud to admit you were lonely, this story is going to hit you somewhere you didn't expect. Stay until the end. Because the moment Silas Mercer finally opens his mouth and says what he's been holding back for years, you'll understand why some silences cost more than any words ever could. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Silas Mercer rode into Harlan Creek to register his land, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind had teeth. He didn't like coming to town. He did it 4, maybe 5 times a year. Enough to sell pelts, restock flour and powder, collect whatever mail drifted in from a sister he hadn't seen in 6 years. The town itself made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully explain. The way a man raised among mountains feels the weight of walls and rooftops pressing in from all sides. Too many people moving too fast, talking too loud, wanting things from each other. He tied his horse, a broad-chested roan named Cutter, to the post outside the land registry office and knocked mud from his boots before going inside. The office smelled of ink and wood smoke and the particular mustiness of paper that had been handled by too many people over too many years. A clerk named Dawson, a thin man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, looked up from behind a desk stacked with ledger books. "Mercer," the clerk said, not quite warmly. They knew each other by transaction only. "Land registration or transfer?" "Registration," Silas said. "The Eastern Ridge parcel. Government's been asking for proof of continuous occupancy." "Right." Dawson pulled out a form and dipped his pen. "You've been on that claim, what, 9 years now?" 8.5. "Alone out there?" Silas looked at him. "That's correct." The clerk wrote something, then asked a series of standard questions. Silas answered them in the same flat, efficient voice he used for everything. Age, 34. Acreage, 212. Primary income, trapping, and some hunting contracts with the fort at Millstone Ridge. Yes, he had a permanent structure. No outstanding debts on the land, no livestock beyond a horse and 2 mules. Then Dawson cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles and asked, almost as an aside, the tone of a man working through a checklist he didn't entirely believe in, "Marital status?" "Single," Silas said. Dawson wrote it, then paused. "And are you seeking a spouse? There's a new federal program running through the territorial office, encouraging settlement of permanently occupied homesteads through—" "No, it's just a checkbox, Mercer. They want to know if you want to be considered for the—" "I said no." The clerk hesitated. His pen moved. Silas didn't watch closely enough to see exactly what the man wrote, because he was already looking out the window at Cutter, making a mental list of what he needed from the supply store. Salt pork. Powder. Maybe new traps if Henderson had any decent ones in stock. He signed the form where Dawson pointed. He rode out of Harlan Creek 2 hours later with his saddlebags full and didn't think about that conversation again. What? That was in October. The letter arrived in February, carried by the postal rider who made the trek up to Silas's cabin once a month when the weather allowed. Silas saw the rider coming from a quarter-mile off, a young kid named Roy who always looked miserable in the cold and who usually brought nothing but a circular from the territorial office and occasionally a letter from his sister Margaret in Billings. He stepped off the porch and met Roy at the tree line. "Got something official for you," Roy said, handing over an envelope sealed with a territorial stamp. "And something else." He handed over a second envelope, this one smaller, with a woman's handwriting on the front. Silas looked at both of them. "You're popular today," Roy said, which was the kind of joke Silas didn't find funny. The boy rode off before getting a response. He opened the official letter first, standing in the cold beside his porch steps. It was from the Territorial Settlement and Homestead Bureau, a department he'd never heard of, using language that seemed designed to be confusing on purpose. The short of it, once he'd read it twice, was this. His registration had been processed, his occupancy confirmed, and, as per his indicated interest in the spousal settlement program, he had been matched with a widow named Eleanor Ann Whitlock, 31 years of age, of Knoxville, Tennessee, currently residing with her daughter in the Bureau's transitional housing in Helena. He read the sentence again. As per his indicated interest. He stood there in the February cold for a long time, the letter in his hand, the wind moving through the pines above him. Then he opened the second letter. "Dear Mr. Mercer," it began, in handwriting that was careful and controlled, the kind a person develops when they've had to be deliberate about every resource, including paper. "I understand this correspondence may come as a surprise. I want to be honest with you from the start, because I think honesty is more useful than pretense when two strangers are trying to figure out whether they can manage a life together. My name is Eleanor Whitlock. I have a daughter, Lucy, who is 5 years old and very much her own person. I am a widow. My husband passed 18 months ago, and since then I have been trying to find a situation that is stable and practical and gives my daughter something to grow up in. I am not sentimental about it. I am looking for something that works. If you are willing, I would like to propose a trial arrangement. 60 days. I will come, I will work, and at the end of that time we will both decide honestly whether this is something worth continuing. If it isn't, I'll go back east and we'll both have lost nothing but 2 months. I don't expect romance. I expect fairness. Yours, Eleanor Whitlock. P.S. Lucy likes dogs if you have one. She will probably ask immediately." Silas read the letter 3 times. He did not have a dog. He went inside, sat at his table, and spent the better part of an hour trying to figure out exactly what Dawson had written in that box. He wrote back. He wasn't sure why. The sensible thing, the thing that matched every instinct he had, was to write to the Bureau, explain that there had been a clerical error, and put the matter behind him. He had a system out here, a routine. 8.5 years of it, refined and tested against every kind of weather the territory could produce. He woke at first light, checked his traps on the eastern line before breakfast, spent the middle hours of the day on whatever repair or preparation work the homestead needed, ran the western line before dark, ate, slept, did it again. It worked. He was fed, warm, solvent. He didn't owe anyone anything, and no one's survival depended on his decisions except his own. A woman and a 5-year-old child would break every part of that. And yet, he sat at his table that night with paper and a pen and a candle burning down toward its end, and he wrote a letter back to Eleanor Whitlock. He wasn't a man who talked much, so the letter was short. "Mrs. Whitlock," he wrote, "I need to tell you there was a mistake with the registration. I didn't sign up for any program on purpose. That said, I read your letter and you seem like a practical person, which I respect. I'm willing to do the 60 days if you are still interested. Fair warning, the cabin is remote and the winters are long and I'm not much company. If that doesn't put you off, I'll meet you at the Harlan Creek Station on March the 4th. Silas Mercer. P.S. I don't have a dog. He mailed it the next time Roy came through. He spent the next 2 weeks trying not to think about it and failing. The cabin looked different suddenly, in the way a room looks different when you know someone else is going to see it. He'd lived in it so long that he'd stopped seeing it. The walls dark with years of wood smoke. The single window so dirty the light came through milky and dim. The table scarred and uneven from a decade of use. The second room in the back that he'd originally built as a winter storage space and then never done anything else with. He fixed the window first, scraped the grime off the glass and replaced a cracked pane with a piece he'd been storing since summer. Light came through differently after that. Cleaner, colder, making the inside of the cabin look more honest than it had in years, which meant it also looked worse. He didn't repaint the walls. He didn't have paint. He swept the floor, which revealed that the boards in the far corner had started to rot, so he spent a day and a half pulling them up and replacing them with timber from his woodpile, which meant he'd be short on wood come the deep cold of March, which meant more cutting. One thing always became another thing. He fixed the latch on the backroom door, which had been broken so long he'd forgotten it was broken. Dragged the old rope frame bed out of storage and checked it. The frame was sound, the ropes needed retying. He found a blanket that had belonged to his mother, wool and still good, folded at the bottom of his storage trunk under a coat he never wore. He held it for a moment. His mother had been dead 12 years, his father longer. He had a sister and a cousin and a small assortment of people he could technically call kin, but the truth was that he'd been alone in the way that mattered, the daily, practical, bone-level way, for most of his adult life. He told himself that was by design. He put the blanket on the bed in the back room and went back to work. The night before March the 4th, he didn't sleep. He lay on his cot listening to the wind move around the corners of the cabin and ran through the conversation he was going to have at the station a dozen times, each version slightly different, all of them awkward. He'd thought about what he wanted to say. Something clear. Something that established expectations without being unkind. He wanted her to understand that this was a practical arrangement, and he intended to honor it the way he honored any agreement, which was to say completely. But that she shouldn't expect warmth or ease or any of the things a woman might reasonably want from a marriage, even a temporary one. He was not built for warmth. He knew that about himself. The wind picked up near midnight. He heard ice forming on the north window, the soft tick and snap of it, and he thought about the fact that a woman and a child were going to be riding through this kind of weather on an open stage, and there was nothing he could do about it. He got up at 3 in the morning and started a fire and made coffee and sat at the table until it was light enough to saddle Cutter. Harlan Creek Stage Station was a long, low building at the eastern edge of town, attached to a livery that smelled of manure and old hay. Silas arrived 40 minutes before the stage was due and stood with Cutter at the rail, watching the road. He was aware, in a way that irritated him, that his heart rate was slightly elevated. The stage came in 7 minutes late, which in March in Montana was practically early. It rolled up in a spray of frozen mud, the driver hauling back on the reins, and the horses, a team of 4 roans, stamped and blew steam in the cold. A man climbed out first, then an older woman with a carpet bag, then a pause. Then a small dark-haired girl in a red wool coat jumped down from the step without waiting for help, landed in the mud with both feet, looked down at her boots, and said, loud enough that Silas could hear it clearly from 15 feet away, "I went in it." A woman's hand came down and took the girl's. Then Eleanor Whitlock stepped out of the stage. Silas had no useful way to describe what he noticed first, because he noticed everything at once, the way you notice a landscape all at once when you crest a ridge. Not details, just the whole shape of something. She was taller than he'd expected. Dark hair pulled back under a hat that was sensible rather than fashionable. A gray coat that had been good once and had been maintained carefully since. Her face was angular and composed, the kind of compose that comes from practice rather than ease. And her eyes, she was looking directly at him before he even moved, like she'd already decided which man in the small crowd was Silas Mercer and hadn't needed much time to work it out. She crossed the ground between them with the child's hand in hers. "Mr. Mercer," she said, Mrs. Whitlock. A pause. "This is Lucy," Eleanor said, looking down. Lucy was looking at Cutter. She turned and looked up at Silas with the unguarded directness of a 5-year-old who hadn't yet learned to pretend. She had dark eyes like her mother and mud on both boots already, and a small scratch on her chin that was a few days old. "Do you have a dog?" she asked. "No," Silas said. She considered this. "That's okay," she decided. "Can I pet your horse?" "Lucy, Eleanor said. "She can," Silas said, surprising himself. He watched the girl walk up to Cutter and put both hands flat on the horse's neck, not tentative, not scared, just direct. And Cutter, who didn't particularly like strangers, lowered his head slightly and exhaled through his nose. Silas looked back at Eleanor. "He doesn't usually do that," he said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. "She has a way with large animals," Eleanor said. "I haven't figured out how to feel about that." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. "Mr. Mercer," Eleanor said, and her voice was the same as her letter, careful, direct, no decoration in it. "I want to say something before we get started, so there's no confusion." "All right. I'm not here to cause you trouble. I'm not here expecting—" She paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who'd thought about this already. "I'm not expecting this to be something it isn't. I read your letter. You were honest, and I appreciated it. I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to pull my weight, and I'm going to keep Lucy from being a burden to you. At the end of 60 days, if you want us gone, we'll go. No argument." He looked at her. "That's fair," he said. "Good." She looked down at Lucy, who was now telling Cutter something in a serious whisper that neither adult could hear. "We have 2 trunks. I packed light." "I've got the wagon," Silas said. The ride to the homestead took 3 hours in good weather. In March, with the road soft from freeze-thaw and one section near the creek crossing still carrying ice on the shoulders, it took closer to 4. They didn't talk much. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench, Lucy between them, wrapped in a blanket Eleanor had produced from one of the trunks, with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to anticipate problems. The mountains came up ahead of them gradually, the pines thickening on either side of the road, the sky getting bigger and more serious the further they got from town. Lucy fell asleep against her mother's arm somewhere around the second hour. "She doesn't usually sleep in the afternoon," Eleanor said quietly. "She was up before 4 this morning, excited." Silas glanced at the girl. She had her face tucked against Eleanor's sleeve, one small fist closed on the blanket edge. "About coming here?" he asked. "About everything," Eleanor said. "She treats everything like an adventure." A pause. "It's one of the better things about her. Sometimes it's exhausting." "You don't have to—" He stopped. She looked at him. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I don't expect conversation." He heard how it came out, flat, possibly rude, and felt the specific discomfort of a man who knows he has said something clumsy but cannot locate the better version of it. But Eleanor didn't look offended. She looked like she was turning it over, examining it honestly. "Is that a preference or a warning?" she asked. He thought about it. "Both, I suppose." "All right," she said, and she looked back at the road. He drove. The horses picked their way through the last bad section of road. Above them, a hawk turned wide circles in the cold air, writing something Silas couldn't see. After a while, Eleanor said, not looking at him, looking at the mountains, "What kind of traps do you run?" He looked at her. "I read that you trap," she said. "In the registration documents the Bureau forwarded." "What kind?" "Steel jaw mostly," he said. "Some snares for rabbits. I run 2 lines, eastern and western. Mink, marten, the occasional beaver if I'm lucky." "How many traps on each line?" 30 on the east, 22 on the west. Why?" She shrugged. "I want to understand how the work runs, so I know where I fit." He didn't know what to do with that either. "You've trapped before?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I can learn things." He believed her. He wasn't entirely sure why. The cabin came into view just as the afternoon light was starting to go sideways through the pines, throwing long shadows across the snow. Silas had always thought the place looked best in that light, the log walls catching the gold in them, smoke coming from the chimney because he'd banked the fire before leaving. It looked like something out of a painting, maybe. If you didn't know that the north wall had a gap in the chinking he hadn't gotten to yet, and the porch step had been rotted through since November. He looked at Eleanor's face as she saw it for the first time. She didn't say anything. Her expression was careful and considered, taking it in the way she seemed to take in most things, without excessive reaction. Lucy woke up as the wagon stopped, lifted her head, blinked at the cabin. "Is that it?" she asked. "That's it," Silas said. She looked at it for a moment. "It's big," she said, which was not accurate. The cabin was approximately the size of a modest barn divided into 2 rooms, but he didn't correct her. He helped them down from the wagon and carried the trunks to the porch while Eleanor held the door. Inside, she stopped in the middle of the main room and turned around once, slowly. The cabin was what it was, a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with supplies. His cot in the corner that he'd pushed against the wall and covered with a different blanket to make it look less like a cot and more like something deliberate. A row of hooks by the door with his coats and gear. The back room beyond the open doorway where he'd put the old rope frame bed and his mother's blanket. It was cleaned anyway. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and something faintly animal that probably came from the pelts stacked near the back wall. "Back room is yours," he said. "And the girls?" "I'll be out here." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he went to check on the horses. But when he came back in, Lucy was already on the floor in front of the fireplace with her coat off, investigating a stick she'd found somewhere. Eleanor had put a pot on to heat and was unpacking something from the smaller of the 2 trunks with quick, methodical movements. "I brought provisions," she said without looking up. "Some of it's perishable, so I'll work through that first. Is there somewhere I should store the dry goods?" He pointed at the shelf. "Second shelf's mostly empty." "Good." She lifted a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it on the table and unwrapped it to reveal a loaf of bread that was miraculously still intact after however many days in transit. She set it on the shelf, then produced a smaller paper package. "Coffee," I didn't know what you had. I had some. Now you have more. He looked at her across the small cabin. You didn't have to, he started. I know, she said. I wanted to. She set the coffee beside the bread, then looked at him directly. Mr. Mercer, you offered me your home in 60 days. I don't take that lightly. I'm going to hold up my end of this. Silas looked at the bread and the coffee on his shelf, things someone had bought for him, thought about him enough to bring, and felt something move through him that he didn't examine too closely. I appreciate it, he said. Lucy looked up from her stick. Mama makes good bread, she said, with the authority of someone stating a geological fact. But not that bread. That bread is from Helena. Lucy, Eleanor said. It's still good bread, Lucy said generously. It's just not Mama's. Do you want to go outside and find a worse stick? Eleanor asked her daughter. I want to find a dog, Lucy said. There's no dog. I know. Mr. Silas told me. She looked at Silas with those direct dark eyes. Why don't you have a dog? He hadn't thought about it in a long time. I travel the trap lines alone, he said. A dog needs more looking after than I've got time for. She considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. If you had a dog, she said carefully, and the dog needed looking after, I could look after it. Then you'd have time. Eleanor put a hand over her face. Silas looked at the 5-year-old. I'll keep that in mind, he said. What? He made space. That was the only way to describe the first week, the constant, quiet business of making space for 2 people in a place designed for 1. That first night was the most uncomfortable. He ate at the table with Eleanor and Lucy, which he hadn't done with anyone in years. Eaten at a table that had a second person at it, let alone 2. Eleanor had cooked with what was available. A simple thing with salt pork and the last of some dried beans she'd brought, augmented with a piece of the Helena bread. It tasted fine. Better than fine. He'd been eating his own cooking for 8.5 years and had forgotten that food could be something other than fuel. Lucy talked through the entire meal. She talked about the stage ride, about a man on the stage who'd had a very big mustache, about whether horses could smell feelings, about what she thought the mountains were made of, about a cat she'd known in Helena named Gerald. She did not require responses. She seemed content to narrate, occasionally looking up to check that she still had an audience, and then continuing. Eleanor ate quietly and efficiently, and didn't try to stop the narration. She caught Silas's eye once across the table, just once, just briefly, with an expression that said plainly, "This is what it's like," with neither apology nor explanation. He found to his surprise that he didn't mind. After dinner, Eleanor washed the dishes with water heated on the stove. Silas dried them, which was something he'd never done for anyone, and the 2 of them stood at the small wash basin in the particular awkward silence of people who don't know the choreography of each other yet. He reached for the same bowl she was setting down, and their hands were briefly in the same space, not touching, but close, and both of them found other things to look at. I'll get that routine figured out, she said. No routine needed, he said. There's always a routine, she said. You just haven't noticed yours yet because you're only doing it for one person. He thought about that later, lying on his cot while the fire burned low and the night wind came down off the mountain. From the back room he could hear Lucy's voice, still talking. Quieter now, probably the end of some story she was telling herself or her mother before sleep. Eleanor's voice, lower, responding with something he couldn't make out. The cabin had a sound it made when 2 people were in the back room, a weight to the air that it didn't have when he was alone. He lay there listening to it for a long time. The first week taught him things he hadn't expected to need to know. Eleanor woke before him. He'd thought he was an early riser. He was up before light most mornings, out the door by the time the sky was going gray at the edges. But the first morning, he woke to the sound of the fire already going and the smell of coffee already made, and when he sat up, she was at the table with a cup in her hands and a small notebook open in front of her, writing something. She looked up without startlement. Coffee's on, she said, and looked back at her notebook. What time is it? He asked. 4, maybe a little past. He looked at the window, dark as a held breath outside. Do you always wake this early? He asked. Yes, she said, without explaining further. He got up and poured himself a cup and stood at the window drinking it. Outside, the snow was faintly blue in the dark, the pines black against a sky thick with stars. He could see the ridgeline, the familiar jag of it against the east. "What are you writing?" he asked. A pause. "Accounts," she said. "I keep track of things." "What kind of things?" "Supplies, money, what needs doing." She glanced up. "What things cost?" He looked at her. "You don't have to. This isn't—" "I know it isn't my money," she said, evenly but not unkindly. "I keep track of my own costs, what I use, what I bring in. So there's no argument about it." He didn't know what to say to that. "My husband," she said, and then stopped and started again. "There were arguments about money in my marriage. I prefer to have the numbers in front of me." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband. The sentence had a flat quality to it, like a stone she'd turned over so many times it had worn smooth. He wasn't going to ask. "The notebook's yours," he said. "Do what you need." She nodded and went back to writing. He finished his coffee in the dark by the window and then pulled on his coat to go check the east line. And the morning went on the way mornings do. Work and cold and the particular silence of a mountain before the world wakes up. Except that when he came back in at midday, there was food on the stove and the table had been moved 2 feet to catch better light from the window, and Lucy was sitting on the floor near the fire, drawing something with a piece of charcoal on the back of an old circular. "What is that?" he asked, looking at the drawing. She held it up. It appeared to be a horse with very large feet and a mountain behind it. "That's Cutter," she said, "and that's your mountain." He looked at it. "He doesn't have feet that big," he said. "He needs them," she said, "because of the snow." She went back to drawing. He stood there another moment. Eleanor came out of the back room and looked at the stove and then at him and said, "I found your salt pork. I hope that's all right." "That's what it's there for," he said. She nodded and stirred something. He hung up his coat and gear and washed his hands in the basin, and the afternoon went on, and it was strange how quickly something strange begins to feel ordinary. By the end of the first week, she had rearranged the supply shelf, found and repaired a blanket that had a moth hole he'd been ignoring, figured out that the draft from under the door could be stopped with a rolled piece of canvas he had in the storage corner, cooked 7 meals that were all better than anything he'd made for himself in recent memory, and identified the gap in the north wall chinking without being told about it. "I can help with that," she said, looking at the gap. It was a cold day, the wind coming in mean from the north, and he could see daylight through the crack in a way that made him obscurely ashamed. "I'll get to it," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I said I can help." He looked at her. "I've done chinking before," she said. "My family had a cabin when I was young. It's not complicated." "All right," he said. They spent a cold afternoon on opposite sides of the wall, working the mixture of clay and fiber into the gap from inside while he checked the outer face. Their communication through that task was almost entirely practical. "A little more here. Try this angle. Is that solid on your side?" The back and forth of 2 people doing physical work together, which has its own kind of conversation built into it. When they'd finished, she stepped back and looked at the wall and said, "That'll hold." "It will," he agreed. "I'll add clay to the list," she said. "The list?" She held up the notebook. He almost said something. He wasn't sure what. There was something about the notebook, about the careful accounting of it, that moved him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Not the notebook itself, but what it meant. A woman keeping careful track of her own costs so there'd be no argument. A woman who had learned that she needed to document herself, justify herself, prove that she was not a burden. He didn't say anything. He went to stoke the fire. The trouble was, once you started noticing things, you couldn't stop. He noticed that Eleanor never sat down to rest until after Lucy was asleep. He noticed that she hummed sometimes while she was working, low and under her breath, songs he didn't know, stopping if she realized he could hear her. He noticed that she read to Lucy every evening by the fire, holding the book, a battered collection of stories she'd brought from Helena, at an angle to catch the firelight, her voice going low and even in a rhythm that made the whole cabin feel slower and quieter. He noticed on the 8th day that Lucy had started calling him by just his name. It happened gradually and without announcement. The first few days it was Mr. Mercer, formal and careful, which he suspected Eleanor had trained into her. Then it became Mr. Silas, which was something in between. Then one morning she came inside from helping him water the horses. She'd started following him to the barn in the morning, something he hadn't discouraged and wasn't sure how he felt about. And she looked at her mother and said, "Silas says it's going to snow again," with the ease of someone who'd been saying that name her whole life. Eleanor looked at him. He shrugged. "She decided that on her own," he said. "She does most things on her own," Eleanor said. He noticed that Eleanor said that with an equal measure of pride and something else, something tired and complicated, the way you talk about a quality in someone you love that costs you as much as it gives you. He thought, not for the first time, about what it must have been like. A widow with a 5-year-old in territorial housing in Helena, trying to build something out of what was left after whatever had ended her marriage and left her alone. He didn't know the specifics and hadn't asked. The husband was dead. There had been arguments about money. The rest he could only guess at, and he wasn't sure guessing was his right. But he noticed things. He noticed she was careful with the firewood, more careful than necessary, always making sure the stack inside was replenished before it got low, the way someone does when they've been cold at some point in a way that left a mark. He noticed she checked the food stores every few days with the same methodical attention, the same notebook. He noticed she kept Lucy's good coat on a specific hook and checked the buttons on it regularly, small things, the constant work of a woman making sure that the most important thing she had didn't fall through the cracks. He didn't say any of this. He wasn't built for saying things like that, but he noticed. The first major storm came at the end of the second week, which was early but not surprising for Montana. The sky went yellow-gray in the afternoon, the kind of yellow that means business, and Silas came in from the west line early and told Eleanor to bring in extra wood and make sure the livestock were secured. "How bad?" she asked, looking out the window. "Bad enough," he said. She didn't ask more questions. She pulled her coat on, and they spent the next 2 hours in the kind of pre-storm preparation that is its own form of conversation. Hauling wood, banking the animals, checking every latch and seal on the cabin, filling every available container with clean water from the well before it froze. Lucy, under strict instructions to stay inside, could be seen through the window peering out with her face pressed to the glass, watching them. The storm hit just after dark. It was a hard one. The wind came out of the northwest with real intention, driving snow horizontal, rattling the cabin in a way that made the walls feel thin. The fire burned high, and Silas fed it carefully, aware of the woodpile, calculating. Eleanor sat with Lucy in front of it, the storybook out, her voice steady against the sound of the wind. At some point, Lucy fell asleep pressed against her mother's side, and Eleanor kept reading for a moment before she realized and closed the book. Silas was at the table, working on a trap that needed a new spring mechanism. The cabin made its sounds, the wind, the fire, the occasional pop and settle of the logs. "How often does it get like this?" Eleanor asked. "Few times a winter," he said. "Sometimes worse." She looked at the shuttered window. "I'm not scared of it," she said. This didn't sound like bravado. It sounded more like she was telling herself something she wanted to be true and checking to see if it still was. "It's a reasonable thing to be scared of," he said. She looked at him. "I've been through a dozen winters here," he said. "I've been scared of it a few times. When I didn't have the wood in, or the cabin was in worse shape than it is now. It's smart to know what it can do." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you do when you're scared of it?" He thought about it honestly. "Work," he said. "There's always something you can do. Even in the storm, there's something. You keep doing things and it gives you somewhere to put the scared." She looked at the fire. Lucy breathed slow and even against her side. "That's good advice," she said. "I think I've been doing that for a while." "Figured," he said. She looked at him then with something in her face that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. The look of someone who had said more than they intended and found, against expectation, that it had been received without damage. He looked back at the trap mechanism and kept working. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it broke, they had been inside together for 70-some hours, the 3 of them in 2 rooms, and somewhere in those 70 hours, without any announcement or agreement, something had shifted. The distance had gotten smaller. Not gone. Silas was still Silas, still quiet, still more likely to show something by doing it than by saying it, but smaller. He taught Lucy to play a card game on the second day, an old game his father had taught him, whose name he'd forgotten. something with counting and strategy that Lucy took to with alarming speed and beat him at twice by the third day. He fixed Eleanor's notebook with a piece of leather cord when the binding started to pull apart, while she was asleep, and left it on the table without saying anything about it. On the morning the storm broke and the sun came back hard and brilliant off 2 feet of new snow, Lucy burst out the front door before anyone could stop her and went face first into the nearest drift, came up coated in white, laughing so hard no sound came out. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was standing in the doorway looking at her daughter in the snow, and she was smiling. Really smiling, not the careful, restrained thing she mostly did, but something unguarded and open and completely without reserve. And Silas looked away quickly, the way you look away from something that's too bright. He went to check on the horses. He stood in the barn with Cutter for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of Lucy shrieking in the snow outside, and he told himself very clearly and firmly that he was not going to be foolish about this. He was practical. He had been practical for 34 years. Practical men did not build feelings out of 3 weeks in a snowstorm and a woman who fixed things without being asked. He told himself this. He did not entirely believe it. The weeks ran on. The arrangement held. And somewhere between the first week and the 5th, Silas Mercer, a man who had chosen his loneliness deliberately and defended it for nearly a decade, found himself doing something he didn't have a name for, something that happened in the margins of days, in the space between one task and the next, in the moment before sleep when the cabin had a sound it didn't used to have, and he lay there listening to it. He found himself looking forward to coming home. He didn't examine that too closely. A man who has spent enough years alone knows how to keep himself from examining certain things. It's a survival skill in its way, not so different from knowing which snow is safe to walk on and which will give way. You learn to feel the ground before you put your weight on it. So he worked his lines and fixed his traps and cut wood and came home to a lit fire and food on the stove, and Lucy telling him things with the urgency of someone reporting important news, and Eleanor moving around the cabin with the particular ease of a woman who had stopped being a guest and hadn't yet decided what else she was. And the 60 days counted down. And Silas kept his mouth shut and his feelings nailed down and told himself he was being practical. He was very good at lying to himself. He always had been. The 38th day was when Silas first noticed the problem with the window latch on the east side of the cabin, which was also, though he didn't know it yet, the day he stopped being able to pretend he wasn't paying attention to Eleanor Whitlock in ways that went beyond practical necessity. The latch was simple enough. The pin had worn loose in its socket, so the window drifted open in wind. He'd noticed it that morning when a gust came through and lifted the edge of the oilcloth Eleanor had put over the supply shelf, scattering her notebook and the small collection of things she kept organized on the far end of the table. He crossed the room and pushed the window shut and bent the pin back into place with a pair of pliers, a 2-minute job. But while he was standing there, he saw what was on the table. She'd been organizing by season. He could see it in the notebook, which had fallen open. A column for what they had. A column for what they'd need by April. A column with small, careful calculations in the margins. Next to it, she'd laid out the dry goods in a specific order he hadn't noticed before. The things that would last longest pushed to the back. The things that needed using arranged toward the front. She'd done this without saying anything about it, without asking him to appreciate it or even notice it. She'd just looked at the problem of winter supplies the way she looked at every problem, directly, practically, and then she'd fixed it. He stood there holding the pliers and looking at the table, and something settled in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of cold water. He put the pliers down and went outside before he did something inconvenient like think about it. Why? The 38th day was also the day Lucy decided she was going to help him run the east trap line. This was not a decision Silas had been consulted on. He came in at noon to find Lucy sitting on the bench by the door, with her boots already on and her coat buttoned to the neck, with the focused expression of someone who had made a determination and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "I'm coming," she said. He looked at Eleanor, who was at the stove and who gave him a look that said plainly, "I already tried." "It's 4 miles," he said to Lucy. "I know," she said. "There's ice on the creek crossing." "I'll hold your hand," she said. He didn't have a response to that. He looked at Eleanor again. Eleanor was very focused on the stove. "She won't slow you down as much as you think," Eleanor said to the pot in front of her. "She's walked further than that before." Silas looked at the 5-year-old on the bench who was watching him with those direct dark eyes, entirely prepared to wait him out. "All right," he said. Lucy stood up immediately, no triumph in it, just the swift practicality of someone who'd known they were going to win and was already moving on to the next thing. They walked the east line. Silas set the pace deliberately slower than he normally would and told himself it was because of the ice, which was partially true. Lucy walked beside him without complaint through the trees and the cold, her breath coming in small clouds, watching everything. She asked questions about every trap, what it caught, how it worked, why this spot and not that one. He answered all of them, more fully than he expected to. "Does it hurt them?" she asked at the 4th trap. "A mink trap, currently empty." He was quiet for a moment. "Fast ones don't," he said. "I try to run the line before too much time passes, so if something's caught, I get to it." She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "But sometimes you don't get there in time," she said. "Sometimes," he said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her, a 5-year-old standing in the snow between 2 pine trees, asking him a real question. "Yes," he said. "It does." She nodded, satisfied with the honesty of it. "Okay," she said, and moved on to the next trap. At the creek crossing, which did have ice on the shoulders but not as bad as he'd made it sound, she reached up and took his hand without preamble, walked across with him, and then let go on the other side with the same matter-of-factness. No ceremony. He looked down at his own hand for a moment, then moved on. He thought, on the walk back, that the girl was going to be extraordinary when she grew up. He thought this with something that felt dangerously close to pride, which made no sense at all because she wasn't his. He didn't examine that thought either. Eleanor was changing the cabin in ways so gradual and inevitable that Silas barely registered each individual change, only noticed the cumulative effect when he stopped and looked at where he was living. She'd done things with the light first, moved the table, as he'd seen, and then added a second candle holder on the shelf so the back half of the room wasn't perpetually in shadow at night. She'd found a piece of red wool fabric in the bottom of her trunk and put it over the small box that served as a step to reach the high shelf. And somehow that one piece of color changed the temperature of the whole room, made it look warmer by several degrees without actually being warmer. The second week she'd organized the tools. Not rearranged them to suit herself, he noticed. Arranged them in a way that made better mechanical sense than how he'd had them. The things he used daily within easy reach of where he usually stood. The things he used monthly further back. She hadn't said anything about doing this. He'd come in one morning and it was simply done, and he'd stood there for a moment and then started his day, and by noon he'd realized he was moving more efficiently through the workspace than he had in years. He hadn't mentioned it, she hadn't mentioned it, but he thought she'd seen him notice because there was something slightly less careful in her face that evening. A small relaxation, like a person who's been holding a question gets to finally put it down. She was teaching herself the cabin the way she seemed to learn everything, by paying close attention over time, not asking for more than she needed, moving at a pace that allowed for mistakes without making them catastrophic. He respected this so completely that it was almost uncomfortable. The difficult part was that she was not always easy. There were mornings she woke in a mood that she didn't explain and didn't excuse, just moved through the day with something compressed and closed in her face that said not today without words. On those mornings she was still efficient, still did the work, but she was also somewhere else at the same time. Somewhere Silas couldn't see and hadn't been invited. He learned by the 3rd week to give her those mornings without comment. He'd take his coffee early and head to the barn and let the cabin be hers for an hour. He'd heard her cry once in the back room after she thought he was asleep. Not a lot. Not the kind of crying that needs responding to, but the quiet, contained kind. The kind you do when you've been holding something all day and night is the only time you have to put it down. He'd lain on his cot and stared at the ceiling and felt completely useless, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to, and eventually the sound had stopped and the cabin had gone quiet again. He never said anything about it. He didn't know what he would say. He started cutting extra wood the next morning, more than they needed. He didn't examine why. It was Lucy who broke the surface first, the way children do, without understanding or caring that they're doing it. They were at the dinner table, the 3 of them, a Thursday night in the 5th week. Eleanor had made something with rabbit and the dried herbs she'd brought from Helena, and it was genuinely good, and Lucy was in the middle of explaining, with great detail, a dream she'd had about a horse that could talk, when she suddenly stopped and looked at Silas and asked, with no preamble, "Are you going to be our dad?" The table went quiet. Silas looked at his plate. Eleanor said, with the controlled voice of a woman keeping a very tight grip on several things at once, "Lucy, that's not... We talked about this." "I know," Lucy said, "but I didn't ask him." "It's not appropriate to ask him that." "Why not?" Lucy looked genuinely puzzled. "I want to know." Silas set his fork down and looked at the girl. She was watching him with complete patience, waiting for an honest answer the way she always waited for honest answers. "That's not something I can answer for you right now," he said. "Why not?" "Because I don't know yet," he said, "and I don't think it's fair to tell you something when I'm not sure of it myself." Lucy thought about this. "That's okay," she said. "Margaret at my old school's dad said he'd come to her recital and he didn't. So I think not being sure is better than saying yes when you don't mean it." Silas looked at his plate again. "That's pretty much how I feel about it," he said. Eleanor hadn't said anything. He could feel her not saying anything, the weight of it. After dinner, when Lucy was in the back room looking at her drawing book, Eleanor came to stand near the fire where he was checking on the embers, and she said quietly, "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be," he said. "She shouldn't have put you on the spot." "She was asking an honest question," he said. "I don't have a problem with honest questions." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He could feel her beside him, not quite looking at him, the way she did sometimes when she was working out what she actually wanted to say versus what was easier. "She's gotten attached to you," Eleanor said finally. "I want you to know that I see it happening, and I haven't been trying to..." She stopped. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He looked at her. In the firelight, her face was harder to read than usual. All the careful control of it softened slightly by the moving light, and there was something behind her eyes that she was working very hard to keep from being legible. "I'm not blaming anyone for anything," he said. "Not her. Not you." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "What about you? Are you attached?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the fire. "I'd be lying if I said no," he said. The words came out more honestly than he'd intended, and he felt the moment right after saying them like a man feels the moment after stepping off a ledge. That fraction of a second in the air before you know how the landing goes. Eleanor looked at the fire too. Her voice when she spoke was careful again, measured, back to where she'd built it. "Then we should both probably be careful," she said. "Probably," he said. They stood there another moment, both looking at the fire, and then Eleanor said goodnight and went to the back room, and Silas stayed by the fire for a long time after, staring at the coals and knowing perfectly well that he was going to ignore his own advice. The thing about the 51st day was that nothing dramatic happened. There was no crisis, no confrontation, no weather event. It was an ordinary day, cold and clear, the mountains sharp against a pale sky. And it was the day Silas understood, with the flat certainty of a man who has stopped arguing with a fact, that he did not want them to leave. He'd been running the west line when it hit him. He was crouching over a trap near the spruce grove that always held marten, and he was thinking about nothing in particular, and then, between one breath and the next, he thought, 19 days. That was what was left of the 60. 19 days, and then Eleanor would take her trunk and her notebook and her herbs and her red wool fabric and her daughter, and she would get on the stage in Harlan Creek, and she would go east, and the cabin would go back to being what it had been. 4 walls and a fire, and the sound of one person moving through rooms. He stayed crouched over that empty trap for a long time. He'd known, on some level, that this was where he was headed. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't blind. But knowing something is coming is not the same as arriving at it, and arriving at it is not the same as being ready for it. And Silas Mercer, who had been ready for almost everything the territory had thrown at him over nearly a decade, found himself on his heels in the snow next to a spruce tree, completely unprepared. He was not a man who fell apart. He didn't fall apart now. He checked the rest of the traps and came home the same as always, same pace, same route. But he was quieter at dinner, and Eleanor noticed. She had a way of noticing things he didn't say that he was starting to find both valuable and terrifying. And she didn't push, just passed him the bread and said something to Lucy about going to bed at a reasonable hour, and the evening moved forward. Later, alone by the fire, he tried to think practically about what he was feeling. That was his instinct, to make a problem practical, to give it dimensions and edges, and then figure out how to work within them. The problem was this. He had told himself for years that the reason he was alone was that it was safer. Not just easier, safer. Men who depended on others got hurt when those others left or died or failed them. He had watched that happen. He had, in his quiet, specific way, experienced versions of it. And so he had drawn a boundary around himself and stayed inside it and done all right. Eleanor and Lucy were inside that boundary now. He wasn't sure how they'd gotten in. He suspected it had happened the same way most things happened, gradually, and then all at once. The fire burned down. He didn't add to it. Outside, the mountain was doing its usual night work. Wind, cold, the distant sound of something large moving through the trees to the north, probably elk. Familiar sounds, the sounds of a place he'd chosen for himself, that had shaped him, that he knew the way you know the inside of your own hand. And now there were two people asleep in the back room, and the cabin held their weight and their warmth. And Silas sat in the chair by the dying fire and admitted to himself, carefully, quietly, with no audience, that surviving alone was not the same as being all right. He'd been confusing the two for a very long time. On the 54th day, Eleanor did something she hadn't done before. She asked him something personal. They were outside, both of them, doing the kind of multi-part late winter maintenance that takes all morning, checking the roof for ice damage from the last storm, looking at the condition of the wood stack, examining the state of the well cover. Lucy was inside, under strict instructions, working on a drawing project she'd been planning for days. Eleanor was on the ladder checking the north edge of the roof, and Silas was below steadying it when she said, not looking at him, looking at the eave she was inspecting, "Why have you been out here alone so long?" He didn't answer immediately. She pulled at a piece of ice, dislodged it, watched it drop. "You're not difficult to be around. You know what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with you that explains 9 years alone." 8.5, he said. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a moment. The ladder was solid in his hands. Above him, she was moving carefully, the way she did everything. "I had a partner," he said. "Early on, man named Dale Pruitt. We trapped together the first 2 winters out here. He was a good trapper. Better than me, honestly." She had gone still above him, listening. "Third winter, we had a disagreement about where to set up the secondary camp," Silas said. "I wanted to go east. He was convinced the Western Ridge was better. We argued about it for 2 weeks, and in the end I gave in. We set up west." He stopped. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. "Avalanche took the camp in February," he said. "Dale wasn't in it. We were both on the line when it came down. But we lost everything. Supplies, shelter, all the furs from 6 weeks' work. We nearly didn't make it back to the main cabin." He could feel her attention on him, still not moving on the ladder. "After that," he said, "Dale went south. Said he was done with Montana. I don't blame him." He paused. "I just decided, after that, it was simpler. Fewer decisions when there's only one person making them. Fewer risks." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "That sounds like a reason to stop trusting yourself, not other people." He looked up at her. She was looking down at him now, one hand on the eave, her face serious and open, not apologetic about what she'd said. "Maybe," he said. "I'm not trying to pick at it," she said. I recognize it, the logic of it. I've used the same logic." He looked at her. "When James died," she said, the first time she'd used her husband's name, "I spent a long time thinking that if I'd just made better decisions, I wouldn't have been in the position of depending on someone who—" She stopped, started differently. "I made myself very self-sufficient," she said. "I got good at not needing things." "I can see that," he said. "The problem," she said, "is that getting good at not needing things starts to feel like strength. And after a while, you can't tell the difference between not needing and not allowing yourself to need. And those are very different things." He held the ladder. The cold moved through his coat. "You're talking about yourself," he said. "I'm talking about both of us," she said. She went back to checking the eave. He steadied the ladder. They didn't say anything else about it, and they didn't need to, and the work went on, and the morning went on, and when they came back inside, Lucy had drawn a picture of the three of them standing in front of the cabin with the mountain behind them. Large, inaccurate, completely confident, and had put it on the table for them to find. Eleanor picked it up and looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it down carefully and went to put water on for coffee. Silas looked at the drawing, 3 shapes, one very small, one medium, one tall, standing in a row. Lucy had given the tall one a hat that looked nothing like any hat Silas owned. She'd given the medium one a notebook. He left the drawing on the table where Lucy had put it. He did not move it. On the 57th day, Eleanor told Lucy that they would be leaving soon, and Lucy cried for the first time since she'd arrived. Silas was in the barn when it happened. He heard it from there. Not the words, just the sound of it, muffled by walls and distance. The particular pitch of a child being told something she doesn't want to hear. He stood in the barn and looked at Cutter and didn't go inside. When he came in an hour later, Lucy was at the table with red eyes, drawing again. Her jaw was set with the determination of a person who has cried and decided that's finished now. Eleanor was at the stove, her back to the room, her shoulders carrying something that wasn't visible from the front. He hung up his coat. He stood at the basin and washed his hands. He looked at the back of Eleanor's head. "You told her," he said. "It's better she has time," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat and contained, the same voice she'd used the morning she arrived at the stage station, the voice that meant she'd made a decision and locked it. "She's upset," he said. "I know." "You don't seem—" He stopped. She turned around. Her face was the composed, angular face it always was, but something around her eyes told a different story, something compressed and controlled that he recognized because he'd been doing the same thing to himself for weeks. "I'm handling it," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I didn't say you weren't." She looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the stove. He sat down at the table near Lucy. Lucy didn't look up from her drawing. "I don't want to go," Lucy said to the paper. "I know," he said. "Mama says we have to." He looked at Eleanor's back. He thought about 19 days, which was now 3, because somehow the 57th day had arrived before he'd come to any conclusion about himself, before he'd figured out what a practical man was supposed to do with feelings that had turned out to be bigger than he'd budgeted for. He looked at the drawing Lucy was making. Another horse. Big feet again. "Can I keep this one?" he asked. Lucy looked up, surprised. "When you go," he said. "Can I keep one of your drawings?" She stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, her chin wobbled once, and then she tightened her jaw the same way her mother tightened hers, a gesture so familiar from so many weeks of watching Eleanor that it hit him somewhere behind the ribs. "Yes," Lucy said. "You can have all of them." He nodded. "I'll pick my favorites," he said. "You need to keep some." She went back to drawing. He sat there, and the fire burned, and Eleanor cooked in silence. And outside, the mountain did what mountains do, stayed exactly where it was, cold and patient and indifferent, waiting for whoever was going to be here in the spring. The question was who that was going to be. Silas didn't know yet, but he was running out of time to figure it out. And for the first time in years, being alone with a decision didn't feel like a relief. It felt like standing outside in the dark, knowing there was a door behind you, and not being able to make yourself turn back and knock. The 58th day started the same as every other day had started, which was the thing about it that made everything worse. Silas was up before 4. Fire going, coffee made, boots on, by the time the sky started doing anything at all with color. He checked the east line alone. Lucy had stayed inside the last 2 mornings, quieter than usual, doing her drawings with a focused intensity that had a sadness in it he couldn't look at directly. Eleanor had been the same, efficient, present, saying everything that needed saying and nothing that didn't. He ran the line in less than 2 hours and came back to find Eleanor outside, standing at the edge of the porch in her coat with her coffee cup in both hands, looking at the mountains. She heard him coming and didn't turn around. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He looked at her profile. The pale winter light was coming in flat, and even from the east, and it caught the angle of her face clearly. Jaw set, eyes somewhere out on the mountain, the careful and composed expression she wore like armor over whatever was actually moving through her. He went inside and took off his coat and poured another cup of coffee and stood at the table and looked at Lucy's drawings, which had migrated from one corner of the table to most of the flat surfaces in the cabin over the past week. Horses, mountains, 3 figures in a row, one drawing she'd made of the East Creek crossing, recognizable because of the bent pine that leaned over it, which she'd drawn with surprising accuracy for someone who was 5. He picked that one up. He heard Eleanor come back inside behind him. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. He set the drawing down and turned around. She was standing just inside the door, cup in hand, still in her coat. Her face was the careful face, but her eyes, up close, were doing something different. There was a decision in them, already made, the kind of decision you can see in someone when they've been carrying it for days and have finally set it where it needs to go. He knew what it was before she said it. "I think we should arrange the stage for tomorrow," she said. "Lucy and I." He was quiet. "The 60 days aren't up until the day after," she said. "But I think it's cleaner. Not to drag the last 2 days out when we both know how the count ends." He looked at her. "Do we?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She heard the difference. "Mr. Mercer." She stopped. Used his name differently, the way she had in the first weeks, before it had become something easier between them. "Silas, you've been fair to us. You've done more than was asked of you, and I want you to know that I see that. Lucy sees it too, in her way." She paused. "But I'm not going to put you in a position where you feel obligated to—" "Who said anything about obligation?" he said. She met his eyes. "Nobody had to say it," she said. "I've been watching you for almost 2 months. I can read you well enough now to know when you're working something out and when you've decided something, and you haven't decided anything." He looked at the floor, then back at her. She wasn't wrong. That was the trouble. He'd been standing outside that door for 3 days, hand raised, unable to knock, and the time was up. And she was making the decision he hadn't made because she was better at protecting herself than he'd given her credit for, and probably better at it than he was. And the worst part was that the thing she was protecting herself from was him. "I need more time," he said. Something moved through her face. Not quite pain. Something more contained than that, more disciplined, something she'd clearly prepared for. "I don't have more time to give," she said. "I have a daughter who's already more attached than is good for her if this isn't going to work out. I have to make choices that account for her first." "I understand that," he said. "Then you understand why I can't wait for you to figure yourself out," she said. Not unkind. Honest the way she was always honest. Directly and without cushion, but also without cruelty. He stood there. She turned and went into the back room. He heard her in there, moving. The soft sounds of a woman packing. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the wood and looked at Lucy's drawing of the creek crossing, at the bent pine she'd drawn from memory. And he sat with what he'd just let happen the way you sit with a cut, the first moment of it, before the feeling fully arrives. Lucy came out of the back room an hour later and stood in the door and looked at him. He was still at the table. He hadn't moved much. "Are we leaving?" she asked. "That's what your mother says," he said. She came and sat across from him at the table, in the chair she'd claimed as hers over the past 2 months without any formal announcement. She put her chin in her hands and looked at him with the particular gaze she had, steady, unblinking, too direct to be comfortable. "Did you ask her to stay?" she asked. He looked at the girl. "Not yet," he said. "Why not?" He didn't have an answer that was simple enough to give a 5-year-old. He wasn't sure he had one that would satisfy an adult either. "Because I'm not sure of the right words," he said finally. Lucy thought about this with the focused seriousness she brought to most problems. "Mama says the right words aren't always the fancy ones," she said. "She says what matters is whether you mean them." He looked at her. "I mean them," he said. "That's not the problem." "Then what is?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Lucy." "What?" "You're 5 years old." "I know," she said. "But I'm asking a good question." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with the low, persistent sound it made on clear, cold days. A sound he'd listened to alone for nearly 9 years. He'd learned to sleep through it, work through it, live inside it without really hearing it anymore. But in the last 2 months, it had changed. Not the sound itself, but what it sounded like from inside a cabin that had two other people in it. "I'm afraid," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out the way things come out when a man has been alone too long and a child asks him a direct question, without ceremony, without cushion, because there's no one left to perform for. Lucy looked at him. She took her chin out of her hands and sat up straighter. "Of what?" she said. "Of asking for something and having it not work out," he said. "Of doing this wrong. I haven't been good at this kind of thing. The kind of thing where other people depend on me and I have to depend on them." She thought about it. "But you've been good at it," she said. "You fixed the window. You let me come on the trap line. You kept the wood in the whole time." She tilted her head. "You fixed Mama's notebook." He looked at her. "She told me," Lucy said simply. "She said someone fixed her notebook while she was sleeping and she knew it was you." He looked at the table. "That's not the same thing," he said. "It's kind of the same thing," Lucy said. From the back room, the sounds of movement had stopped. He didn't know what that meant. He thought about Eleanor in there, surrounded by the careful order she'd imposed on the small space. The trunk repacked, the blanket folded, his mother's wool blanket that he'd put on the bed and never taken back because he didn't know how to do that without it being a thing. "If we go," Lucy said, "are you going to be okay?" He looked at her, a 5-year-old, asking him if he was going to be okay. The answer that came was the honest one, which surprised him. "No," he said. "Probably not." Lucy looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, came around the table, and with the businesslike efficiency she brought to most physical tasks, she put her arms around his neck in a hug that lasted approximately 4 seconds before she let go and went back to her side of the table and sat down. "Then you should tell her that," she said. "Those are the right words." He looked at the girl. She picked up her charcoal and went back to drawing. He found Eleanor in the barn, not packing, just standing near the stall where Cutter was. She had her hand on the horse's jaw the way Lucy had done the first day at the station, and she was looking at nothing in particular, and she heard him come in but didn't move. He stood near the door. "I need to say something," he said. "Silas, let me say it," he said, "before I can't." She turned and looked at him. In the barn light, which was dim and even, her face was less guarded than it had been inside. Or maybe he could read it better now. After 58 days, he knew the architecture of it, which lines went deeper when she was worried, how her shoulders held different weight depending on what she was carrying. "I haven't said the things I should have said," he said, "because I don't know how to say them. I want you to know that's the truth and not an excuse. I am genuinely not built for it. I have spent a very long time living in a way where nobody needed to hear anything from me, and I never needed to say it, and I let that go on too long, and now I'm standing here trying to do something I don't have the practice for." She was watching him, not moving. "I don't want you to go," he said. Silence. "That's not me trying to honor an arrangement," he said. "That's not practicality. I have been practical my whole life, and this is the first time in a long time that what I actually want and what's practical are pointing in the same direction, and I almost let it go because I was too—" He stopped, found the word. "Too scared to say so." Eleanor was very still. "I'm not saying it's easy," he said. "I'm not going to stand here and promise you something I can't guarantee. The winter is long and I'm not easy to live with, and I have more rough edges than I probably even know I have. But I know that the cabin is different with you in it, and I know that's not a thing I want to unfind." Something crossed her face. He couldn't name it exactly. It was too many things at once. "You had 2 months," she said. Her voice was quiet, not accusing, just honest. "Why now? Why not 3 days ago? A week ago?" "Because I was afraid," he said. "The same reason I told Lucy." She blinked. "You told Lucy?" "She asked," he said. "She's hard to lie to." Eleanor looked at him, and for a moment the composed face cracked the smallest amount. Not a lot, just a hairline, the kind of crack that lets light through without letting the whole wall come down. "She asked me if I had a dog," he said. "The first day. I told her no. She told me she could take care of it if I got one. She was 5 years old and she was already solving problems for me." Eleanor's voice was very controlled when she said, "She does that." "I know," he said. "She gets it from somewhere." Eleanor looked away, looked at Cutter. He watched her jaw tighten and then release, the visible effort of a woman who had built herself into something self-sufficient and strong and was standing in a barn being asked to let someone else matter, which was the specific kind of risk that strong people find hardest. "I made a decision this morning," she said. "I don't make decisions lightly. I spent the last 3 days watching you and trying to figure out if you wanted us here or if you were just being decent about the arrangement. And I couldn't tell, and when I can't tell, I make the safe choice." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you now." "It might be too late," she said. "It might be," he said, "but I'd rather know that than not say it at all." She turned and looked at him fully then. He stood in the cold barn doorway with his hat in his hands and looked back at her. And he didn't try to make himself look like anything in particular. He was a 34-year-old trapper with cold in his coat and a bad habit of silence and more years of loneliness behind him than he'd like to count. And he had stood at this same barn every morning for nearly 9 years. And he was standing in it now saying something that cost him more than most things had ever cost him. He thought she could see all of that. He hoped she could. She didn't answer him right then. That was the thing about Eleanor. She didn't do anything fast that she'd decided to do carefully. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I need to think." And she walked back to the cabin, and he stood in the barn with Cutter for a while, the horse breathing warm air against his hand, the cold settling into the afternoon the way it did this time of year, patient and inevitable. He was good at waiting. He'd spent his life at it. But this kind was different. This was the kind of waiting where you know the outcome matters, and you can't do anything to influence it, which is the specific kind of helplessness that a man like Silas Mercer is least equipped to handle, because it requires him to simply stand still and let something unfold on someone else's timeline. He stood in the barn until the light started going sideways, and then he went back inside. Lucy was at the table with her drawings. Eleanor was at the stove. The cabin was doing the thing it had been doing for nearly 2 months, holding the three of them in its 4 walls like a place that had decided it was something more than 4 walls. And Silas hung up his coat and washed his hands and sat at the table, and nobody said anything about what had happened in the barn. They ate dinner. Lucy talked about whether or not elk could swim. Eleanor ate in the same focused silence she always did. He passed her the bread when she reached for it, and their fingers touched at the edge of the cloth, and neither of them moved immediately, just a half-second longer than necessary. And then she took the bread and he looked at his plate. After Lucy was in the back room, they were alone by the fire the way they'd been alone by the fire on dozens of evenings. Him on one side with something to fix or do with his hands, her with the notebook or a piece of mending. But tonight, she wasn't writing anything. She was just sitting there, her notebook closed, looking at the fire. He fixed a loose rivet on a trap spring, or tried to. He was aware of his own hands in a way that made doing precise work difficult. After a while, she said, "When James died, I told myself I wouldn't do this again." He waited. "Not because he was a bad man," she said. "He wasn't. But the depending on someone, the building your entire situation around another person who can then be there one day and gone the next. I promised myself I'd learned that lesson." "That's a reasonable lesson to learn," he said. "It is," she said. "Except—" She stopped. "Except what?" She looked at him, across the fire. "Except I've been here for 58 days, and somewhere in those 58 days I stopped feeling like I was depending on you, and started feeling like we were depending on each other, which is a different thing, and it scares me more." He looked at her. "Because depending on each other means I have to admit that I want to stay," she said. "Not because it's practical, not because it's a good arrangement for Lucy, because I want to." She said it plainly, with the same directness she brought to everything, and it cost her something. He could see it cost her, the slight tightness around it, the way she held herself straight. And wanting things has not worked out very well for me. He set the trap spring down on the table. "I can't promise you it will this time," he said. "I can't promise you the winter doesn't get harder than last year, or that I don't turn out to have problems you haven't found yet. I have them. You've just probably found the obvious ones." He paused. "But I can tell you that I've been living in this cabin for 9 years, and the last 2 months have been the first time in all of that where I didn't wish for the day to end faster, where I actually wanted more hours in it." She looked at the fire. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said very quietly. "It isn't." The fire shifted. A log settled, sending up a brief cascade of sparks that died before they reached the chimney. Outside, the mountain was doing its night work, the wind at the eaves, the trees responding in that low collective way that had been the only company Silas Mercer had kept for most of his adult life. He waited. Eleanor Whitlock, who made decisions carefully and meant them fully and did not go back on them once they were made, sat with the fire, and with her own fear, and with everything 58 days in a Montana cabin had taught her, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm not easy either, you know." He looked at her. "I have bad mornings," she said. "You've seen them. I keep accounts of everything because I don't trust abundance, which is exhausting to live with. I'm not—" She stopped, and something almost rueful moved through her expression. "I'm not soft, I know that. I've worked very hard to not be soft." "I don't need soft," he said. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things that makes this harder." He didn't say anything to that. He'd said what he had. He didn't have more words to add to it, and adding more words to fill the silence felt like the wrong move, like talking over something that needed to be heard. She picked up the notebook from her lap and opened it to the last page she'd written on. He could see the columns from across the fire, the familiar handwriting, careful and precise. She ran her finger down a column. He couldn't see what it said. Then she closed it. "The stage doesn't run tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "It runs Tuesdays and Fridays," she said. "Today is Wednesday." She met his eyes, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile, but was the thing before a smile, the moment when someone decides to let the thing through. "I was going to ask Roy to carry a message to arrange a special run." "Were you?" he said. "I was," she said. "I hadn't decided for certain." He held her gaze. "What are you deciding now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think I'm deciding that I've been wrong about a few things." She looked at the fire. "I told myself you'd never truly wanted this, that you were just being decent. That's what I decided in the last 3 days." "And now?" "And now," she said, "I think maybe I was deciding that because it was easier than the alternative." "What's the alternative?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "That you did want it and couldn't say so, and that those are very different problems." The fire burned. Outside, a gust moved through the pines and then settled. He thought about what to say, and then he stopped thinking about what to say because he was doing the thing he always did, reaching for the precise construction, the measured response, treating words the way he treated everything, like something to be managed rather than something to mean. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "Stay," he said. Just that. One word, no architecture around it. Her throat moved. She looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she looked back at him. "Okay?" she said. He breathed. The word went through him the way the first real warmth goes through after a long cold. Not comfortable, not smooth, nothing like smooth. Just real and sudden, and something he hadn't known how badly he'd needed until he had it. They sat by the fire a while longer without saying much. At some point she opened the notebook and wrote something in it. And he didn't ask what. At some point he went back to the trap spring and actually fixed it this time, his hands steadier than they'd been all evening. When she stood to go to the back room, she stopped near his chair and looked down at him. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I didn't want to go." He looked up at her. "I know," he said. She went to bed. He sat by the fire for another hour, long after it had burned to coals, and he looked at the room around him. The tool shelf she'd reorganized, the candle holder she'd added, the red wool on the box by the window, Lucy's drawings spread across every flat surface they'd slowly colonized over 8 weeks. The cabin that had been one shape for 9 years and had become a different shape so gradually he hadn't seen it until it was already done. Outside, the mountain sat where it had always sat, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent. The same mountain that had watched him survive alone season after season, that had taken his isolation as simply another feature of the landscape. He looked at it through the window for a while. Then he banked the fire for the night and went to his cot. He lay there listening to the sounds of 2 people sleeping in the back room. He was not going to make promises to himself about how this was going to go. He was not built for that kind of thing. The grand interior declaration, the vow, the clean resolution. He'd tried to build his life on things that held their shape under pressure, and the only things that held their shape under pressure out here were things that were true. So he held on to what was true. Eleanor was still here, Lucy was still here, the cabin had their weight in it, and in the morning, whatever morning held, they would all three still be on the same side of the same door. That was enough. For now, that was enough. He closed his eyes. He slept better than he had in 3 days. The morning after was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Silas was up before 4. Fire going, coffee made, boots on, the same sequence it had always been. But when Eleanor came out of the back room at 4:30, earlier than usual, which meant she hadn't slept much either, and found him at the table, neither of them said anything about the night before right away. She poured coffee. She sat at the other end of the table with her notebook. He watched her open it to a fresh page and write something at the top, and he didn't ask what. After a while, he said, "I was thinking about the spring." She looked up. "The East Line needs a new anchor post at the 3rd station," he said. "The wood's been rotting since fall. I've been putting it off." She looked at him steadily. "All right. And the north wall is going to need another pass at the chinking before it gets warm. What we did held through the winter, but it won't hold another one." "I know," she said. "I've been watching it." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'm not good at this," he said, "talking about things that aren't concrete." "I've noticed," she said without heat. "I just want you to know that when I'm talking about the East Line post and the chinking," he said, "I'm also talking about other things." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sky was still fully dark, the mountains invisible behind it. "I know that too," she said. He nodded. That was enough. He drank his coffee, and she wrote in her notebook, and when Lucy came out an hour later, still half asleep with her hair pushed to one side, she looked at both of them at the table, and something in her small face went visibly and completely calm. The way a child's face goes when the thing they've been worried about without knowing how to name it has resolved itself. She didn't say anything about it. She climbed onto her chair and put her head down on her arms and went back to a light doze. And Eleanor reached over without looking up from her notebook and straightened the collar of Lucy's nightgown, and the morning went on. On the 61st day, one past the arrangement, which nobody mentioned, Silas rode into Harlan Creek alone. He had business at the land office, which was true. He also had something else he needed to think about without the pressure of 2 people in close proximity, which was also true, and he was honest enough with himself to admit that both things were the reason for the trip. The land office took 20 minutes. He filed a supplementary registration form, answered Dawson's questions in the same flat economy he always used, and turned to go. "Heard you had company out at your place," Dawson said. Silas stopped at the door. "The bureau match," Dawson said. He wasn't being unkind about it, just informational, the way small-town men discuss facts that have circulated without requiring anyone to actively spread them. "The widow and her girl." "That's right," Silas said. "How'd that go?" Silas turned around and looked at him. "Well," he said, "it went well." Dawson looked faintly surprised, as if he'd been expecting a different answer. "Good," he said. "Good. The program. Some of those work out, some don't. Never quite sure which it'll be." "Neither is anyone," Silas said, and left. He stood outside with Cutter for a few minutes, looking at the street. Harlan Creek was doing its usual midweek business. A few wagons, the sound of the forge from Hennessy's shop, a woman coming out of the dry goods store with a basket. Ordinary town doing ordinary things. He thought about what he'd said to Eleanor the night before last. Stay. One word, and she'd said okay. And he'd spent the last 36 hours trying to figure out what came after okay. The answer, he decided, was not complicated. The answer was the same thing it always was out here, the next thing. You did the next necessary thing, and then the one after that, and you didn't try to see further ahead than the work allowed. He went into the dry goods store and bought salt and flour and 2 spools of thread that he didn't need but that Eleanor had mentioned offhand 2 weeks ago. He bought a length of good rope for the East Line post. He stood at the counter for a moment and then asked, before he could think better of it, whether the store had any licorice root. The man behind the counter looked at him. Silas had been coming into the store for 9 years and had never bought candy of any kind. "Candy jar, far end," the man said. Silas bought a small paper bag of it and put it in his coat pocket. He rode home. Lucy found the licorice root before he'd fully hung up his coat. She'd been watching him unpack the saddlebags the way she watched most things he did, with focused, unblinking attention. And when the paper bag came out, she was at his elbow immediately. "What's that?" "Candy," he said. She stared at the bag, then at him, then at the bag again. "For who?" she asked, with the tone of someone who needed the answer to be a specific thing. "Whoever wants it," he said. She took the bag from him with both hands and opened it and looked inside with the reverence of a person examining something genuinely precious. Then she carefully took one piece, exactly one, and folded the bag closed and held it out to him. "You should keep this," she said. "So it's fair." He took it back. "All right. Can I have another one later?" "After dinner," he said. She went back to the table with her one piece of licorice root held carefully in both hands, satisfied with the outcome of the negotiation. Eleanor at the stove had her back to him, but her shoulders were doing the thing they did when she was trying not to smile and mostly winning. He put the bag on the supply shelf between the salt and the coffee, where it looked exactly as out of place as it was, and he left it there. It was Eleanor who said the thing that needed to be said on the 63rd day. The way most important things got said between them, not in some constructed moment, but in the middle of something else, when the edges were down because both of them were occupied with ordinary work. They were mending fence on the east side of the property, the section that ran along the spruce grove. One of the upper rails had split over winter, and the posts on either end had shifted in the frost heave, a common problem and a half-day's work to fix properly. She held the rail while he drove the fastener, and they'd been working in comfortable quiet for most of the morning. She said, "I think we should go to town." He looked up. "Together," she said. "The three of us. And not just for supplies." He looked at her. Her face was its usual composed self, but there was a color in it that wasn't from cold. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm not trying to push you," she said. "I just think, if we're doing this, we should do it. Not live in the arrangement that stopped being the arrangement 3 days ago." He set the hammer down on the fence rail and looked at the spruce trees for a moment. The light was coming through them at an angle, throwing long shadows over the snow, and somewhere in there a Clark's nutcracker was doing its repetitive, slightly maddening call. "I wasn't planning to not do it," he said. "I know," she said, "but planning and doing are different." He looked at her. She was watching him with the directness he'd gotten used to and would, he realized, miss badly if it were ever not there. "Friday," he said. "Stage doesn't run, and it won't be crowded. We can take the wagon." Something in her face released, not dramatically, just a small settling, the way a door looks different once it's properly latched. "Friday," she said. He picked up the hammer. "Hold that rail steady," he said. She held it steady, and they finished the fence, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the silence between them was the kind that has been earned. He told Lucy that night after dinner. She was at the table working on a drawing, a new one, more ambitious than usual, what appeared to be the entire mountain range rendered in charcoal on the back of a supply circular. She'd been working on it for 2 days. "We're going to town on Friday," he said. "The three of us." She didn't look up immediately. She added a line to the mountain's ridge. "What for?" she asked. He glanced at Eleanor, who was washing dishes and not interjecting. "Some things need doing at the courthouse," he said. "Official things." Lucy looked up then. She had charcoal on her chin from where she'd apparently rested it on her hand at some point. She looked at him with the specific expression of a 5-year-old who is working out whether the adults are telling her everything. "What kind of official things?" she asked. "The kind that make arrangements permanent," he said. She stared at him. "Do you know what permanent means?" he asked. "Yes," she said, with the slight offense of someone who'd been reading for 2 years. "It means it stays." "Right," he said. She looked at Eleanor's back, then at Silas. Then she looked at her drawing for a moment, and then she put the charcoal down carefully on the edge of the table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with an expression he'd never quite seen on her face before. Something older than 5, something that had been waiting behind all the questions and the licorice root negotiations and the horse drawings for exactly this. "Okay," she said. Just that. The same word her mother had used. Then she picked up her charcoal and went back to the mountain. He looked at Eleanor. She still hadn't turned around from the dishes, but her hands had stopped moving. He got up and poured himself more coffee and stood at the window, and outside the mountain was there the same as always, and the pines were there, and the dark was there, and all of it was exactly the same as it had been the day he'd first arrived here with one horse and a plan to be left alone. It looked different now. He wasn't sure he could have explained how. Friday came with a clear sky and a cold that had some bite left in it, but not the deep structural cold of full winter. More like a reminder than a threat. Silas had the wagon ready by 7. Eleanor came out with Lucy in her good coat, the one with the buttons Eleanor checked regularly, and a hat Silas hadn't seen before. A small dark blue thing that sat neat on Lucy's head and that she was clearly aware of, because she kept touching the brim. "New hat?" he said. "Mama made it," Lucy said. He looked at Eleanor. "I had the wool," she said simply, and climbed up to the wagon bench. He helped Lucy up and then climbed up himself, and the three of them sat in a row, Lucy in the middle the same way she'd ridden on the way from the station 2 months ago, except that 2 months ago the silence between the adults on either side of her had been the silence of strangers trying to calibrate, and today it was something else. The road was better than it had been in March. The worst of the frost damage had started to ease, and the creek crossing was running clear and cold, no ice on the shoulders. Lucy watched everything with the focused attention she brought to the world, asking questions about the birds, about why one section of the road had more mud than another, about what was in the bag in the back of the wagon. "Supplies," Silas said. "And the other thing?" she said. "What other thing?" She gave him a look. He'd underestimated her, again. "That too," he said. She sat back, satisfied. Harlan Creek. On a Friday was quieter than on registration days or supply runs when the Fort Riders came through. There were maybe a dozen people on the main street. The usual business, nothing remarkable. Silas pulled up at the courthouse, which shared a building with the land office and the territorial judge's second Tuesday operation. He tied the wagon and helped Lucy down. Eleanor stood on the boardwalk and looked at the building for a moment. He stood beside her. "You don't have to be nervous," he said. "I'm not nervous," she said, in a tone that confirmed she was. He looked at her sideways. "Eleanor?" "I'm fine," she said with slightly too much conviction. "You've done this before," he said. "That," she said, "is not actually helpful." He almost laughed. He caught it before it fully happened, but she caught it anyway, and her mouth did the thing, not quite a smile, the precursor, and she exhaled once and straightened her coat. "All right," she said. "Let's go." The judge was a man named Cowboy, old enough to have officiated at half the marriages in the territory over 30 years, with the dry, unhurried manner of someone who has seen everything and stopped being surprised by any of it. He looked at the three of them when they came in. Silas in his cleanest coat, Eleanor in the gray one she'd arrived in, Lucy in the blue hat, and got out his register without much ceremony. "Mercer," he said, reading from the land office notes Silas had filed. "And Whitlock." "Yes," Silas said. "Witnesses?" Silas hadn't thought about witnesses. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. From the doorway a voice said, "I can do it." They both turned. Roy, the postal rider, was standing in the hall outside with a mailbag over his shoulder, apparently having been in the building for some entirely separate reason and having made a fast decision. "I'm already here," Roy said, with the mild helpfulness of a young man who has stumbled into something and decided to be useful rather than awkward. The judge looked at Roy. "You're old enough?" "I'm 22, Roy said, slightly offended. "Fine," the judge said. "Get in here." It was not an elegant ceremony. The judge read the legal language in the flat voice of a man reading legal language, which is its own particular sound, procedural and permanent at once. Silas said what he was supposed to say when he was supposed to say it. Eleanor said the same. The judge had them sign the register, and Roy signed as witness, and the whole thing took 11 minutes. Afterward, standing outside on the boardwalk, Roy shook Silas's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had genuinely enjoyed the experience, said congratulations to Eleanor, and then looked at Lucy. "Nice hat," he said. "Thank you," Lucy said. "My mother made it." Roy tipped his own hat and went on his way. The three of them stood on the boardwalk in the pale March sun. Eleanor had the copy of the register document in her hand, folded careful the way she folded things. Lucy was looking at the street with the satisfied expression of someone who had been present at an important event and was filing it away properly. "Well," Eleanor said. "Well," Silas said. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a brief, slightly awkward moment where neither of them was sure of the choreography, which was, he thought, honest, which was how they'd done most things. And then he reached over and took her hand, which was not something he'd done before, and her fingers closed around his with an immediate, unpracticed grip. And that was that. Lucy looked at their joined hands and then looked straight ahead at the street. Can we get something to eat?" she asked. "I'm hungry." They ate at the only public dining room in Harlan Creek, a place above the hardware store run by a woman named Mrs. Peterson, who made a beef soup that was the best thing in the territory, or at least the best thing Silas had eaten in years, which was not a wide field of competitors, but was still genuine. Lucy had 2 bowls and used her bread to clean the second, which Eleanor allowed without comment. It was nothing like a celebration in any formal sense. The dining room was half empty. Mrs. Pedersen was brisk and practical. The soup was hot, and the bread was yesterday's but still good. There was no particular ceremony to it. But Silas looked across the table at Eleanor, who was eating with her usual focused efficiency and simultaneously watching Lucy's bread maneuver with the resigned expression of a woman who had learned to pick her battles. And he thought that this was what it actually was, the real version of it. Not the formal language in the judge's office, not the document in Eleanor's coat pocket, but this. Soup. Ordinary afternoon. Lucy stealing the bread from the basket when she thought nobody was watching, which everyone was. "Lucy," Eleanor said, without looking. "I was going to put it back," Lucy said. "You were not," Eleanor said. "I was going to eat it first," Lucy amended, "and then not need to put it back." Silas said nothing. He ate his soup. Eleanor caught his eye, and the thing at the corner of her mouth happened, and this time she let it go the rest of the way, and she smiled. The real one, unguarded, the same one he'd looked away from in the snow weeks ago because it was too much. He didn't look away this time. He looked at it directly, and it was still a lot, and he didn't care. On the way home, Lucy fell asleep against his arm on the wagon bench, her blue hat slipping sideways, the whole weight of her trusting and complete. He drove with one hand and left the other where she'd leaned into it and watched the road ahead, where the mountains were starting to go pink at the edges in the late afternoon light. Eleanor sat on Lucy's other side, the document in her coat pocket, her hands in her lap. After a while, she said quietly, so as not to wake Lucy, "Thank you for not waiting longer." He looked at her. She was looking at the road. "I almost did," he said. "I know," she said. That's what I'm thanking you for, not doing it." He looked back at the road. The pines moved past on either side, the familiar ones, the ones he knew the shapes of. The creek crossing came and went. The road climbed the way it always climbed toward the homestead, the mountain getting larger and more specific as they got closer to it, the way a thing you know well becomes more itself the closer you get. Lucy stirred once, said something that wasn't words, and resettled. He could feel Eleanor beside him without looking. The particular warmth of someone close, the subtle weight of a person choosing to be where they are. The cabin came into view at the tree line, smoke starting from the chimney because he'd banked it before they left, the windows catching the last of the afternoon light. It looked, he thought, like somewhere someone was expected back. It looked like a home. He pulled the wagon up and set the brake and looked at it for a moment. This thing he'd built with his hands 9 years ago to keep weather out. This set of 4 walls he'd lived in alone through 8 brutal winters. This place that had become something different without him fully deciding it should. Lucy woke up when the wagon stopped, lifted her head, looked at the cabin. "We're back," she said, with the simple satisfaction of a child returning to somewhere familiar. "We're back," Silas said. He climbed down and helped Lucy, who went immediately to the porch with her hat still sideways and her boots already muddy from somewhere in town. Eleanor climbed down herself, not waiting for help the way she never waited for help, and stood beside him looking at the cabin. "The north wall," she said. "I know," he said. "Next week." "And the east line post. Also next week." She looked at him sideways. "You're going to keep putting it off." "I'm going to prioritize," he said. She made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. Is that what you're doing? That's exactly what I'm doing, he said. She shook her head and went up the porch steps, and he stood there a moment longer in the late afternoon cold, looking at the mountains above the tree line, the shapes of them familiar as his own hands, patient and enormous, and indifferent to everything that happened at their feet. He had lived in their shadow alone for 9 years. He had been very good at it. He went inside. The fire was waiting. Eleanor was already at the stove. Lucy was in the back room. He could hear her moving, probably getting rid of the good coat and back into her regular one with the efficiency of a child who knows that good things are preserved by not wearing them casually. He hung up his coat. He stood in the middle of the main room, in the cabin that had Eleanor's reorganized shelf and her extra candle holder, and the piece of red wool on the box by the window, and Lucy's drawings on every flat surface, including, now, a section of wall near the fireplace where Lucy had taped 3 of them with pine resin, which had required a conversation. He stood in all of that, and he did not feel like a man who had given something up. He felt like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had finally, without the clean dramatic moment such things were supposed to have, simply put it down. Spring came the way it always came to that part of Montana. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost. Snow in April that was gone by afternoon. The creek running high and loud with melt, then dropping back, then rising again. The mountain doing what mountains do, which is refuse to be rushed by anyone's calendar. Silas fixed the east line post in the first week of April. Eleanor helped, the same way she'd helped with the chinking, where she, practically, without ceremony, handing him things before he asked for them because she'd been watching how he worked long enough to know the sequence. Lucy sat on a nearby log and narrated the process for an audience that existed only in her head, a habit she'd developed that neither adult had tried to stop because it was, in its way, useful. She noticed things from the outside that the people doing the work were too close to see. That one's crooked, she said, of the post he'd just set. He looked at it. It was slightly crooked. I know, he said. I'm going to adjust it. I could see it from here, she said. You're very helpful, he said. I know, she said, without irony. Eleanor caught his eye over the post, and the thing at the corner of her mouth happened, and he looked back at his work. But he was smiling, which was something that happened more often now, and that he was still not entirely accustomed to, the way his own face felt when it did that. The north wall chinking took 2 days and turned out worse than expected, which was the nature of deferred repairs. When he pulled the old material away from 2 sections, he found the log beneath had soft spots that needed cutting out and replacing, which meant half a day sourcing timber from his stockpile and another full day of the actual work. Eleanor worked beside him for most of it. By the end of the second day, they were both covered in clay, and neither of them was in a particularly good mood, and they ate dinner in a silence that was tired rather than companionable. I should have done that in October, he said. Yes, she said. You don't have to agree immediately. I agreed because you're right, she said. I'm not trying to make you feel bad about it. I know, he said. You always say that, she said. I know, even when you don't. He looked at her. I know when I do and when I don't. Do you? He thought about it honestly, the way she'd taught him to by example, whether she'd meant to teach it or not. Most of the time, he said. She accepted that and went back to her food. These were the conversations they had now. Not the careful, measured exchanges of 2 strangers trying not to say the wrong thing, but the slightly abrasive, honest back and forth of people who had decided they were stuck with each other and had relaxed into it. It wasn't always comfortable. He said things that came out wrong. She had her closed mornings, the ones where she moved through the cabin somewhere else. They disagreed about where to store the winter tools when spring came, and the disagreement went 3 days before they found something neither of them fully liked, but both could live with, which he'd learned was usually how real solutions looked. It was nothing like the life he'd imagined, back when he'd imagined things. It was harder in some ways and better in others, and mostly it was just real, which turned out to be the thing he'd been missing without knowing what to call it. In May, a letter came from Eleanor's sister in Knoxville. He knew it was from the sister because Eleanor told him, without detail, and then took it to the back room and was in there for a while. When she came out, her eyes were slightly different, not red, not wet, just older by a few hours. He was at the table. He didn't ask. She sat down across from him and put the letter flat on the table and looked at it. She wants to know if I'm all right, Eleanor said. She's been writing to the bureau address and they've been forwarding it. Are you going to write back? I already did. She'd brought paper and a pen from the back room, he saw now. The letter was already written. She'd just wanted to sit with it a minute before it was gone. Do you get along? He asked. Eleanor considered. We get along the way sisters get along, she said, which is to say we know each other too well to be entirely comfortable. She looked at the letter. She didn't think I should come west. She thought I should come stay with her in Knoxville. She has a house and a husband and a spare room. Why didn't you? He asked. He'd never asked before. She was quiet a moment. Because the spare room was exactly that, she said. Spare. I didn't want Lucy growing up in a spare room in someone else's life. She folded the letter she'd written. I wanted to give her something of our own, even if I wasn't sure what that was going to look like. He looked at her hands on the letter. Does she know? He asked. Your sister, what happened here? She knows I got married, Eleanor said. I told her that much. I kept the details for a later letter. She paused. I didn't know how to explain it. What's hard to explain? She looked at him steadily. That it worked, she said. That's the part that's hard to explain. People expect a story where things go wrong, where the man was difficult, where I had to fight for something, where it was a mistake that I made the best of. She tilted her head slightly. Not a story where a man who didn't mean to sign up for anything turned out to be... She stopped. What? He said. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded look she gave him now sometimes. The one that had replaced the careful, composed face she'd worn like a coat for the first weeks. Worth staying for, she said. Simply, without decoration. He didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he usually did with things that were too large for him to handle with words, which was to reach across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the letter. She turned her hand over and held his. I'll figure out how to explain it eventually, she said. No rush, he said. She squeezed once and let go and stood up to take the letter out to leave for Roy on his next pass-through. Boss, Lucy turned 6 in June. He hadn't known until Eleanor mentioned it 2 weeks before, which sent him into a quiet and slightly panicked calculation of what a 6-year-old wanted for her birthday. He had no framework for this. His own birthdays had been mostly unmarked since childhood, practical occasions at best, forgotten at worst. He didn't know the rules. He asked Eleanor. She wants a dog, Eleanor said, without looking up from the stove. He stood there. She's been wanting a dog since the first day, Eleanor said. You know that. I know, he said. I just didn't think... I'm not telling you what to do, Eleanor said. I'm answering your question. He stood there another moment. Then he went outside. He thought about it for 3 days. A dog was not a simple decision out here. A dog needed food and care and created complications on the trap line. He'd had reasons against it that were legitimate practical reasons, not just excuses. He went to see a man named Garrett who ran cattle 6 miles south and who he knew kept working dogs. Garrett was a taciturn man, which Silas respected, and they had the conversation in under 10 minutes. Garrett's best dog had had a litter in March. 3 already placed, 1 remaining. A female, black and tan, with what Garrett described as good sense. Good sense how? Silas said. Doesn't chase what she can't catch, Garrett said. Knows when to be quiet. He bought the dog. He brought her home on a Thursday in a burlap sack tied loosely at the top, which the dog accepted with the philosophical calm of an animal that had decided early to trust people and had not yet found a reason to revise that position. Lucy was outside when he came up the path. She saw the sack. She looked at the sack. She looked at him. What's in there? She said. Birthday present, he said. She stared. You've got 2 weeks until your birthday, he said, but I figured we'd need the time. He untied the sack and set it on the ground, and the dog stepped out and sat down and looked at Lucy with calm, amber eyes. Lucy did not make a sound for approximately 4 seconds, which was the longest Silas had ever heard her be silent. Then she sat down in the dirt directly in front of the dog, right there in the path, and the dog leaned forward and touched its nose to Lucy's nose, and Lucy made a sound that was not quite a word, something compressed and overwhelmed and completely 6 years old, and put both arms around the dog's neck. Eleanor was on the porch. She had her arms folded against the May cold, and she was watching her daughter sit in the dirt with a dog. And when Silas looked up at her, she was doing the thing she did. The real smile, unguarded, the one she'd stopped hiding sometime in April, and that still, months in, cost him a beat every time he saw it. "She's going to sleep with that dog," Eleanor said. "Probably," he said. "In our bed," Eleanor said. "We'll work that out," he said. Lucy looked up from the dog's neck. "Her name is going to be Maple," she announced. "Why Maple?" Silas asked. "Because she's the right color," Lucy said, with the confident finality of someone who considers the matter settled, and went back to the dog. He looked at Maple. Maple looked at him with the amber eyes. He had the distinct impression the dog was reserving judgment, which he respected. "All right," he said. "Maple it is." What nobody tells you about choosing to stop being alone is that the hardest part isn't the choosing. The hardest part comes after, in the ordinary days when there's no crisis to rise to and no dramatic moment to carry you through. Just the regular business of two imperfect people and one 6-year-old and a dog trying to share a small cabin on a mountain in Montana and not grind each other down in the process. Silas was not, as Eleanor had correctly identified, easy to live with. He had 9 years of solitary habits baked into his bones. He moved through the cabin on routes that made sense only to him. He had opinions about where tools went that were strong enough to qualify as convictions. He went silent for hours sometimes, not in anger, just in the way a man goes silent when he has spent most of his life alone, and silence is still his natural resting state. And Eleanor had learned to read the difference between productive silence and the kind that meant something was wrong, but the learning had taken time and occasional friction. For her part, Eleanor was not soft, as she'd told him. She held opinions and didn't let go of them easily. She kept the accounts with an attention that occasionally made him feel like a line item, though he understood where it came from. She was not demonstrative in ways that were visible to anyone outside the two of them. She didn't reach for him in front of others, didn't say things she hadn't thought about, but he'd learned her language the same way she'd learned his. He knew that when she fixed something in the cabin without being asked, it was because she was invested. He knew that when she put his coffee on the table before he came in from the morning check, it was because she'd heard him on the porch. He knew that the notebook wasn't just accounts. She'd started keeping other things in it, observations, ideas, a record of what was happening in this place, this life, as if she needed to write it down to believe it was real. He understood that impulse. One night in late July, when the summer had loosened everything, and the mountain was green all the way up to where the rock started, and the days were long enough that the light was still going at 9 in the evening, he came in from the west line to find Eleanor sitting on the porch steps instead of inside. This was unusual. She was not a porch-sitting person by nature. He unsaddled Cutter and put him in the barn and came back and sat beside her on the steps. Inside, through the window, he could see Lucy asleep on her cot with Maple curled against her legs, which was exactly the arrangement Eleanor had predicted, and which had required zero negotiation because by the second night it was simply what happened. Eleanor had a cup of something warm in her hands and was looking at the mountain. He sat with her. After a while, she said, "I've been thinking about something." "All right," he said. "Lucy's going to need schooling," she said. "Real schooling, beyond what I've been doing with her." He'd thought about this. The nearest school was in Harlan Creek, which was 3 hours by wagon, not a daily proposition. "I know," he said. "I don't want to take her into town to board," Eleanor said. "She's too young." "I agree," he said. "I've been writing letters," she said, "to the Territorial Education Office about whether there's a provision for a traveling teacher, someone who covers remote homesteads." She paused. "There's a program, not guaranteed, but there are teachers who take circuit routes." He looked at her. "When did you start writing those letters?" "April," she said. He sat with that. April was when the frost was still coming and the wall needed rechinking and they were still working out the tool storage disagreement. She'd been writing letters to the Territorial Education Office in April and hadn't mentioned it because she was still, he understood this now, still not entirely sure she had the right to plan that far ahead. Still not entirely sure she was allowed to assume. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "You can plan things," he said. "You don't have to wait to find out if it's all right." She held her cup. "Old habit," she said. "I know," he said. I've got them too. She looked back at the mountain. The education office said there's a teacher named Miss Voss who does a northern circuit. She could potentially include us if we're on the route. Write back and tell them yes, he said. I already did, she said. I wanted to tell you about it. That's different from asking permission, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She said it with the small private weight of a woman who has spent time in situations where those two things were not allowed to be different, and who is still learning, in her bones, that they are. He put his arm around her shoulders. Not because it was a dramatic moment, not because the mountain light was doing something beautiful behind them, which it was, just because she was there and that was where his arm wanted to go. She leaned into it, briefly, then straightened because she was Eleanor, and that was how she did things. She accepted warmth and then stood back up under her own weight, which he'd stopped trying to change because it was part of who she was, the same way his silences were part of who he was. And you don't take the grain out of the wood. I think it's going to work, she said, quietly, looking at the mountain. He looked at the mountain too. He knew she wasn't talking about the school. I think so too, he said. By the time the second winter came, the cabin had changed enough that a person who'd seen it in the early days would have noticed the difference, though they might not have been able to name all of it exactly. The walls were solid, the chinking tight all the way around. There was a second lamp on the east wall. Lucy's drawings covered an entire section above the fireplace, fixed properly with small tacks Eleanor had found at the hardware store in town, the collection growing week by week. Horses, mountains, maple in various poses, a carefully rendered portrait of Silas that looked nothing like him, but that he'd looked at more than once when nobody was watching. The supply shelf had a system that both adults understood and that Lucy was beginning to learn. The tool corner had order to it. The back room had become fully Lucy's. She'd arranged it with the focused territorial instinct of a child who has been given a space and intends to inhabit it completely. Maple slept inside on cold nights, a concession Silas had made by the second week of October, and that he told himself was practical. The dog had turned out to be, as Garrett had promised, good sense. She ran with him on the trap lines without chasing anything she shouldn't, was calm with Lucy in the specific way some dogs are calm with children they've decided to protect, and had the quality Silas valued most in any living creature, which was that she didn't require more than she needed. He'd written to his sister Margaret in November, a real letter, longer than any he'd sent in years. He told her about Eleanor and Lucy, about the cabin, about the fact that things had changed in a way that he was still getting used to, but that was, he wrote, good. He used the word good twice in the letter, which for him was extravagant, Margaret wrote back in December. Her letter was warm and long and contained several sentences he had to read twice, and one that he thought about for days. I always figured you'd come around eventually. I just didn't figure you'd need someone to arrive in a wagon to make it happen. He showed Eleanor the letter. She read it and looked up with a real smile. I like her, Eleanor said. I've never met her and I like her. She'd like you, he said. You're both difficult. Thank you, Eleanor said, meaning it. There was a morning in December, the 2nd December, when Silas woke before 4 the way he always did and started the fire and put the coffee on, and Eleanor was already at the table with her notebook the way she always was, and Lucy was still asleep in the back room, and Maple was at the foot of the door waiting with patient certainty to be let out. He let the dog out. He stood in the open doorway for a moment in the cold dark, looking at the mountain, the pines black against a sky that was just beginning to suggest at its lowest edge that somewhere behind all that dark, something was thinking about going pale. He'd stood in this doorway alone for 8.5 winters. He knew this particular dark the way he knew the inside of his own hands. Behind him, he heard Eleanor set her pen down, heard the small sound of the notebook closing. Coffee's ready, she said. I know, he said. He came inside and closed the door and poured 2 cups and set one at her end of the table. She had the notebook closed in front of her and her hands around the cup before it was fully on the table, warming them. He sat across from her. Outside, the mountain was still doing its thing, patient, enormous, indifferent. It had watched him survive alone for a long time. It would watch him do this for a long time now, this different thing, this harder and better thing. He thought sometimes about the version of himself that had stood in this same cabin in October 2 years ago, reading a letter from a woman in Helena and almost didn't write back. That man had been fine. Functional, capable, intact. He'd had everything he needed to keep surviving, and he'd known it. What that man hadn't known. What Silas understood now, with the specific clarity that only comes from having the thing you didn't know you were missing, was that surviving and living are not the same weight. They feel similar from the inside when surviving is all you know, but they aren't. One is what you do when you're waiting for something. The other is the something. He hadn't known he was waiting. That was the part that still caught him sometimes. Late at night when the cabin was quiet and the fire was low, 8.5 years of waiting and calling it a preference. "You're thinking," Eleanor said. "I am," he said. "About what?" He looked at her across the table in the early dark, the coffee between them, the notebook closed for now, the back room quiet with a sleeping 6-year-old and a dog that had migrated, predictably, from the foot of the cot to beside it. "About how close I came to not writing back," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her cup. "Me too," she said. "I almost didn't send the letter in the first place. I wrote 3 versions of it." "What was different about the 4th? "I stopped trying to sound like I didn't need anything," she said. "I just said what was true." He looked at her. "That's the whole trick, isn't it?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "That's the whole trick," she said. The light outside was beginning its argument with the dark, the slow, pale negotiation of a winter dawn. Inside the cabin, the fire was going and the coffee was hot, and the mountain outside was exactly where it had always been. The man who had built 4 walls on a hillside to keep the world out sat across from the woman who had arrived with a suitcase in 60 days and no illusions, and they drank their coffee in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped pretending they don't need each other, which is not, it turns out, a weakness. It is the hardest thing. It takes more nerve than any winter, more courage than any mountain, more endurance than any 9 years of deliberate solitude. To say I need this, to say I want to stay, to write the 4th version of the letter, the one where you stop performing, not needing, and just say what's true. Silas Mercer had survived everything the Montana frontier had thrown at him over 9 years. He had been cold and hungry and afraid and alone in ways that would have broken men with less stubbornness in them. He knew how to endure. He had built endurance into himself like a structural wall, load-bearing, non-negotiable. What he hadn't known how to do, what Eleanor Whitlock and one extremely direct 5-year-old had quietly, practically, without any grand announcement, taught him, was that endurance alone is not enough. A wall that only holds weather out but lets nothing in is just a wall. A home is something else. A home is what happens when you let the right people through the door and then, finally, with all the nerve you have, ask them to stay. He had asked. She had stayed. From the back room came the small sounds of Lucy waking. The creak of the cot, a word said to the dog, Maple's nails on the wood floor. Then Lucy's voice, distinct and already fully awake. "Is there food?" "There will be," Eleanor said, without raising her voice, because 9 months of this had calibrated them to the exact volume the cabin required. "How soon? How fast can you get your boots on?" A pause. The sounds of boots. Silas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. Outside, the mountain and the morning and the pines and all of it. The whole enormous, indifferent frontier that had tested him for 9 years and would go on testing him for as long as he was here, none of it had changed. It was all still exactly what it was. But he was not the same man who had ridden into it alone. And the cabin, when Lucy came through the backroom doorway with her boots on the wrong feet and Maple at her heels and her hair going in 3 directions at once, was not a place where one person kept the world at arm's length anymore. It was loud and warm and imperfect and full. It was home.